Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host. Each program, we talk about issues that are important for elections. We hope to inspire you to talk to others about those issues. And most important, when election time comes around, we want to help you be ready and willing to go vote. Today's topic is election protection and voter rights, and we'll be talking with our guest, Geri McLarty, who's an attorney and the Voting Rights Director for Nebraskans for Civic Reform. Welcome, Geri.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about what is Nebraskans for Civic Reform and its mission? And
Sure. Nebraskans for Civic Reform is a kind of a new nonprofit. We were started in 2008 by our executive director, now State Senator Adam Warfeld, actually in his dorm room at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He started off with the Government Liaison Committee at ASU and the student group, and just kind of noticed that there wasn't really a lot of engagement of college students, and he wanted to change that. So we want to work to create a more modern and robust democracy, and that's how Nebraskans for Civic Reform kind of got started, and that's our tagline. We want to work to create a more modern and robust democracy. It started off mostly with voter accessibility and modernizing our election systems, but since then we've realized that it's more than that. It's about civic engagement and getting everyone involved in Nebraska. So what we have three main, programs. The first is our youth civic engagement, and that's done by Kent Day. He's our Director of Civic Engagement, and he works with youth from elementary school all the way to high school, working to teach them about how to be involved in their community. We work with service learning projects to really engage them in their community and show them that they can make a difference in ways to get involved. The second is our civic engagement program as a whole, and that's done by our director, Kelsey Ahrens, and she works to engage members of the community, so not just students, but teachers, parents, anyone in the community that wants to create and be more involved in their community. So we do that with community leaders, and that's what the Civic Health Summit will be, but also with rural civic action. So we're going into rural communities and working with teachers and students there about getting involved. And the last one is my program. I think it's the best one. It's the Voting Rights Program. And so I work to, once everyone's involved and they have access to their civic institutions, my job is to make sure that those rights are protected. When I see that there's a barrier to someone being involved, that's where I come in, and I work through litigation, advocacy, and other forms to make sure that barriers are removed and people can be involved, and once they're involved, that there's nothing stopping them.
okay. And your offices are located, are they just in Lincoln, or do you have offices elsewhere?
We actually have offices here in Omaha as well. Kent works out of the Civic Engagement Center at the Barbara White's on UNO's campus, and then we have also offices in Lincoln, and we actually have a satellite kind of mini office in Kearney. We just moved out there. Gosh, this last school cycle, we have a teacher at UNK that works our rural civic action program out there.
Okay. So talk a little bit about yourself and your background. You're an attorney working for the organization, and what attracted you to working for Nebraskans for Civic Reform?
Yeah, I'm actually a new attorney. I just graduated this past spring and passed the bar in September. Very happy about that. It actually all started for me in high school. I went to Girls State and I loved it. I introduced a bill about electoral college reform, lost terribly, but it was a great experience for me, and I kind of, I guess, found my calling. I went on to school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to get a degree in political science, and I actually worked for a couple years at the Nebraska legislature and fell in love with the unicameral, fell in love with everything to do with politics. I eventually took some time off and decided to go back to law school, or I guess go back to school for law school. I did a couple of internships. I worked with a county attorney, I worked with a private attorney, and my favorite by all clerkship was with Nebraskans for Civic Reform. I was there for a year as a law clerk. I did a lot of legislation and lobbying, and so when the job opportunity arose, I immediately jumped at it. Okay.
So one of the things that the organization's been focusing on in Nebraska is civic health, and a report, the first one ever for the state, was done in 2015. Could you just tell the viewers briefly what is civic health?
Civic health is about social connectedness and engagement in your community. So many people think it's voter registration or going and turning out to vote, but it's so much more than that. It's about communicating with your neighbors, being involved in your community. Some of the ways that we measure civic health is social connectedness. How often do you have dinner with your family? How often do you feel comfortable asking your neighbor for a favor? And so the Civic Health Index really measured a lot of these different factors to kind of get an overall idea of civic health in Nebraska, and that's what the report goes through. So the things like voter registration and turnout, but also how comfortable we feel with our civic institutions, the trust we have in them, as well as the trust we have in our communities and neighbors.
Okay. Let's focus on your particular area and what the report had to say about voter registration and contact between elected officials and constituents. It was one of the areas I think that it said we might be a little weak in this area. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, of the 4 different programs that our director of civic engagement, or Kelsey Ahrens, looked at in the people that did the report, the one, voter registration, was the lowest, specifically political involvement, which was so surprising considering we are so high for trust in civic institutions as well as social connectedness, and we already feel a passion and a connectedness to our communities, but it just wasn't translating into actual political involvement. So some interesting numbers were voter registration. Respondents said about 69% said they were registered to vote, and about 65% said that they turn out in local elections, but only 12% are actually contacting their elected officials. And so for us looking at that, we see a real disconnect. People are willing to register, they're willing to be a part of the electoral process, but they're missing the 4 years in between. And so that's what we want to do, is break down those civic barriers and kind of figure out why. Why aren't they calling their state senator? Why aren't they calling their city council member? So that's one of the issues that we really want to take a look at, and we're kind of glad we exist because that's one of the things we want to help solve. So it was very surprising, and we feel like it's maybe a circular kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, in 2014, only about 37 to 40% of voters turned out and voted in a midterm election. And that's obviously a little less than the 65% that reported it in 2012. And so we want to figure out why, and we think maybe not contacting their elected officials or not feeling like their representative is possibly causing kind of a down spiral in who's turning out to vote. At Nebraskans for Civic Reform, we believe very strongly that the democracy needs to be representative of what the community is. And just looking kind of briefly at the legislature, it's easier, there's 49 of them, it's a little easier to count. Only 20% are women, but we're 50% of Nebraska. You look at some of the minority representation, and it's just not quite there. And so we feel that perhaps the 12% of people that are talking and the 88% that aren't, maybe because they feel that their democracy isn't representative. So then that kind of circles back to, well, why isn't it representative? Is it because our elections aren't as accessible? So that's kind of what we're looking at with NCR and how the civic health does tie into how accessible are elections.
So you're doing some research then on finding out from people if are they reluctant to talk to their elected officials? They really don't know how, or they don't think they can?
Yeah, that's what Kelsey and I are working on, looking at. She's going to have her big civic health summit where we're looking and talking to community leaders. So she's kind of talking to the stakeholders and the members of the community. I'm looking at what the institution and kind of the process is. And so we've seen some. Nebraska isn't too bad when it comes to election law, but there are some ways we could make it more accessible. So for example, the Douglas County Election Commissioner is way out on 115th and Dodge, and you're talking about someone who may not have a car. That's an hour car ride from North or South Omaha, or an hour bus ride, sorry. A car ride, it's about 20 minutes, assuming you have a car. So maybe questions aren't being answered or services aren't being rendered to individuals that could make our democracy more representative.
Okay. Well, let's talk more about your specific role as Director of Voting Rights. And this is one area that really dovetails a lot with what the League of Women Voters is all about and been doing with voting registration and helping voters. And one of your missions is to work on nonpartisan voting rights and protections. So could you talk a little bit about that, your experience this past year in working on that?
Yeah, there's actually 4 ways that the Voting Rights Program works to have nonpartisan election accessibility. The first is the most obvious, which is litigation. When there's an issue, we tend to bring either administrative action or legal action to kind of stop it, an injunction, if you will. We saw this in 2012. There was an individual, Fautos Floyd. She's blind, and she and a couple of friends went to go vote early, but the election automark machine wasn't set up yet. So now we had a demographic that wasn't able to vote early when everyone else could because it wasn't accessible. So we brought an administrative challenge to that, and we're able to kind of just get someone to say, yeah, you messed up and you can't do it again. And sometimes that's enough to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So litigation is one way we do that. Another is election observation. So that's where we go to polling locations. We have nonpartisan election observers there to make sure that kind of nothing funny is going on. People aren't being asked for things they shouldn't, people aren't being turned away when they shouldn't, and that the election on election day is accessible. The one that we're kind of in the middle of right now is our advocacy in our legislation. So we're looking at introducing bills, we're looking at stopping certain bills to make sure that we keep elections accessible and in attempts to modernize them as well. And then finally, the last one is advocacy, and that's where we get to work a lot with the League of Women Voters, where we go out into the community and provide resources and assistance for individual voters or voting blocks about if they have questions. A lot of the ones that we get are former felons who aren't quite sure about if they can re-register or when, yes, if they're even allowed. We also have some issues with youth voters, college students who aren't sure, should I stay registered in Ainsworth where I'm from, or should I, I was a transplant, I came from Texas, so I wasn't even sure if I could vote in Nebraska. So educating college students about, one, they can register if they want to in their college town, and then educating them about the process and how that works.
Okay. And so is this all part of the Know Your Rights campaign that you're doing? Talk a little bit more about that, indeed.
Yep. And that's where the Know Your Rights campaign kind of came from. In working with coalition partners, we saw so many questions being asked time and time again. And so what we did is we realized that there wasn't a comprehensive guide anywhere. If you wanted to know how to register to vote, you can find like a couple FAQs or it's on the application. So those ones seem to be pretty accessible. But when you start talking about, oh, I'm studying abroad this year in France, or I'm going to be out of town, not knowing that you could vote early or that you could even request a ballot. If you wanted to request a ballot and wanted to know how, you had to find the application that had the instructions. But if you didn't know there was an application then that you could, how did you know where to go? So what the Know Your Rights campaign is a comprehensive guide from the day one, can I even register, to what do I do on election day? And it has everything there about voting early, about how you may live in a mail-only precinct, how you may actually have to, for special elections, you get mailed your ballot and you don't even have to go on election day. And then it also talks a little bit about illegal activities on election day, that you can't be polled, that someone can't be coercive and tell you who to vote for, and kind of letting them know what to expect on election day. So we have the general guide, but then we also have specific populations, and this is the former felons, students, individuals with disabilities have a whole host of rights to accommodate their disability, whether it be curbside voting or use of the automark machine. So we really want to make sure that this information was given to those demographics as well. And so that's what the Know Your Rights campaign is. We have, the brochure was the first part, and we're slowly working on going out into the community, doing things like mobile voting, kind of legal offices, where I go and people can come and ask questions, and I can say, former felon wants to ask me, when can I register? I ask, okay, well, when were you off paper? Let's count the 2 years. Okay, not quite yet. You got to wait 1 more month and don't do it beforehand. So that's kind of what the Know Your Rights campaign is looking at doing this next election cycle.
Okay. And if a viewer wanted to see the brochure, look at the information, how would they get a copy of it?
Yeah, we have printed copies, so they can always call and request, and we'd be happy to mail it to them. But we're also online on our website, nerefor.org, so nereform.org. Okay. We have all of the PDFs available, and we're slowly getting them translated into different languages. So excellent. We have Spanish right now. We're almost done with our Arabic version. We're also working on having it done in Karen, and I can never remember the 5th language, but we're working on, and we're of course willing to take requests. We work with a bunch of different translators. So if someone wanted a specific Vietnamese translation, we'd work to get that done.
Excellent, okay. Very interesting about the mobile units. Will you be in Omaha doing that with questions that can be answered?
Omaha is actually the place that we plan on launching it. Just looking at where the Douglas County Election Commissioner is and recognizing the needs of some of the communities. We want to be there in the community. We want to be in North and South Omaha. We're working with community leaders there. But we also want it to be at times that were the most convenient. The election commissioner is really only open from 8 to 5, but some people, they have a question at 7, or they want they want help on the weekends, and that's what we plan on doing. Is not saying the Douglas County Election Commissioner isn't doing a great job, but that we can be there to fill in when he's kind of constricted with time.
Okay. And one of the other things you mentioned that's of particular interest is if someone sees something on election day that they're unsure of, their approach, they think they were asked a question that was improper or asked to do something, what should a person do if they think that there's something that's not quite right?
Well, we have an election day hotline. So one, if they see something or if they're turned away and they don't feel like it was appropriate, they can call us at Nebraskans for Civic Reform. We have an office line. We'll be publishing it on our website as well as all across Facebook and Twitter, social media, newspapers, to let people know that if there's an issue, call us. Sometimes it's just as simple as calling back, talking to the poll worker or talking to the county election commissioner and saying, hey, this is happening in a precinct and it really should be stopped. I mean, when we work with other civil rights attorneys and civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Nebraska Appleseed, we always kind of say we're working on one of the rights that has kind of a time limit. There's a 12-hour window, and once that election day is gone, they can't get it back. Someone wants to go protest in front of Pinnacle Bank, well, they can live to fight another day, but that election day, once it's gone, it's gone. So we really want to make sure that we're available, that we're easy to get a hold of, and that people know to call us, so that way they don't walk away and all of a sudden 801 hits and they didn't get to have their voice heard.
Okay. One of the things that came up in the unicameral last session was, again, the voter ID bill
Yes.
that came forth, and the League of Women Voters and Nebraskans for Civic Reform did not support that, and it was not passed by the legislature. So let's talk about the unicameral, this next shorter session. Do you see voter ID coming up again? Where does that at? Is that dead in Nebraska, or do we have to worry about it again?
Actually, fun story, that was actually introduced today.
Oh!
So it was one of those, I was in the lobby and I was just celebrating that one of our proactive pieces of legislation had just been introduced, and I was kind of savoring the moment that this great bill was introduced, and then I get a text, hey, did you see the new bill? And there it is, a voter ID bill, LB 912. Okay. It's a little different than the one that we had with Senator Larson's LB 111, but it still puts the onus on the voter, and that's our biggest issue with voter ID. The administration should make it as easy as possible to vote, and unfortunately they're now asking voters to show up with utility bills and driver's licenses and things that not everyone carries on election day. And the biggest issue with this bill is that it only applies to a smaller sect of people, which some may say, oh, well, that's great, there's less people impacted. But it's actually worse, because now there's a small group of Nebraskans that have no idea that they're going to be subject to this rule. And all of a sudden they show up on election day and, well, the person in front of them wasn't asked for a utility bill or a driver's license, and now they are. And they have no warning, no knowledge that they're going to need this. And so that's our biggest issue with this bill. We just really don't appreciate it when the honors, like they took the time to show up on election day, and now we're adding more and more restrictions, more and more requirements. Okay. And that's just one of the biggest issues. And of course, who it impacts disproportionately are always individuals that are the least represented. So this is, the new twist on it is going to make it more difficult for people who have trouble getting ID, like a birth certificate or something like that? It's really going to impact those that move around a lot. So we're talking about youth, we're talking about low income, individuals that tend to move every couple years. You know, they don't stay in the same house for 25 years, and that's what's going to put them on this list, and that's what's going to require them to provide identification. So once again, it's impacting those who we want to hear more from. We don't want to restrict their access, and we don't want them to be turned away on election day. Okay. So I would imagine you'll be doing, and we'll be doing more work on this, and you would encourage viewers to contact their legislator to tell them what they think about this bill. Okay. Definitely. Anything else that you see coming up in this session on the unicameral on voting rights or elections? Yeah, there's actually two pieces of legislation that we're working on. One is a pretty fun one. I always enjoy it. It's a ballot selfie bill. About a couple months ago, the Secretary of State pulled up kind of an archaic statute that was put in the 90s to address possible voter coercion. So vote selling, proof of voting a certain way in exchange for money. And pretty much it says that you can't take a photograph of a marked ballot. Specifically to, I guess, prevent coercion. The issue being, how are they going to know that you took a picture of it? But the Secretary of State has interpreted this to say that this now bans the ballot selfie. You know, the kid who's excited about voting, they hold up their ballot, they take a picture, they post it on Facebook, and they say, just voted today. And it's kind of the I voted sticker of the 21st century, especially on social media. The problem is that the Secretary of State's now saying and trying to apply the statute to it, saying it's going to be a misdemeanor and a $100 fine. So what the bill does, it's introduced by Senator Moorfeld, it's LB 787, is it just carves out a specific exception. We keep the language about coercion. We don't want people to be selling votes. But what we do is we carve out an exception for someone that voluntarily takes a picture of their ballot. They have no negative or terrible, aims. The whole goal is just to share with their friends that they're excited that they voted today. And they don't mind saying who they voted for. It's a free speech issue. You're more than welcome to tell the entire world who you voted for. You just shouldn't get slapped with a $100 fine for it. So that's what the bill does, just to clarify the language so that no one gets punished for being excited about voting.
Okay.
The second piece of legislation that was actually just introduced today is called the Election Technology Committee Bill. It's actually a legislative resolution introduced by Senator Hansen. It's to create a select committee to address the issue of election technology and equipment. A lot of the equipment that we have now, the automark machines that are used by individuals with visual disabilities or physical disabilities, were purchased back in 2004 to 2006 with federal dollars from the Help America Vote Act. Well, the money's gone. It's been gone for a while. And these machines are now getting to be about 10 years old, which is about the end of their life cycle. They maybe have an election or two left in them, but it's one, they're old, and two, it's getting incredibly hard to find the technology to run them. So for example, what they store the actual data on is a zip drive. Election commissioners can't even order zip drives anymore. They have to find them on eBay, wipe them clean, and then recycle and reuse them. So now we're talking about, we were in a committee hearing talking about this, and I had an intern that turned to me and said, "What's a zip drive?" And I stupidly said, "Oh, it kind of looks like an 8-track player," and then they just completely had no idea what I was talking about. So what this committee would do is, it's the chair of government and the chair of appropriations, plus 5 additional senators. They're going to take a year-long look here in a presidential cycle, which is the best time to look at what we actually need for elections, what machines we need. And they're going to study it, everything from the feasibility of keeping the machines that we have to replacing them with new machines, and then honestly answering what is considered the $20 million question of who's going to pay for it. In the past, we weren't required to have automark machines. Counties typically are in charge of their own election budget, except that the state owns the machines and maintains them. Well, the state purchased it with federal dollars. The Secretary of State doesn't know if he's going to have the money. He's estimating $20 to $25 million to replace them. If it does come from the state, we're going to need a separate budget and appropriations for it. So this committee will really look at what's the best way to operate moving forward as a state. Some states do a 50-50 split. That's what Maryland does. County pays 50%, state pays 50%. Others use the purchasing power of the state, where the state buys it as a contract, same machine across the state, which is great if there's some sort of issue where people can trade machines or trade parts, and then they're kind of leased to this county, and the county kind of pays back the state. Some of the states offer loans. So this committee is going to look at everything. No stone's going to go unturned. It's going to make sure that moving forward and starting in 2017, we have an answer about how we're going to have these election machines and how we're going to fund them.
Okay. And so that primarily would be the automark machines. Does it include things like optical scanners for any other type of machines?
Yep, we included that. We wanted to give the committee a wide breadth of, discretion in what to look at. Okay. The vote tabulators are one that they will be looking at specifically for smaller counties. I know like Douglas County has replaced them themselves. Yes. Lancaster is actually leasing them. In Grand Island, just to kind of give you an idea of how expensive these machines are, they just purchased one vote tabulator, optical scanner, for $100,000. And the automark machines are about $5,000. In Douglas County alone, there are 244 automark machines. That's about $1.2 million that Douglas County may have to spend to replace automark machines. So a lot of the counties are very interested in hearing how this funding is going to happen.
Because you need at least one per polling place, right?
Yep, you need about one per polling place, and in some polling places you need one for every 500 registered voters. Okay. So some of the bigger polling places,
so with 228 polling places in Douglas County, you're talking about a lot of machinery.
We're talking a lot of machinery and a lot of dollars.
Okay. Any other legislation that would affect elections? Is anything happening with redistricting plans, or where do we stand with that?
Redistricting is actually, we're kind of on the periphery of it. We usually leave that to Common Cause. They're a transparency and government accountability nonprofit and are much better versed in redistricting than we are. But I know that the redistricting bill, I believe it was LB 580, introduced by Senator McLarty and Senator Mello collectively, is still in committee, but the goal is to have it pushed out and debated this year. I know that's something that Senator Mello, looking at one of his last session, I know he really is interested in getting that out and making sure that we have nonpartisan redistricting in Nebraska. And we were kind of sitting on the bill waiting for Arizona's court case to come out, and it came out and it's beneficial to Nebraska. What we're looking at doing has been upheld by the court in Arizona, so they're feeling a little more confident about it. So I'm hoping that's something we get to this year.
Okay. So that pretty much would be the major things with elections and voting that you see in the unicameral this year.
Well, there's 5 more days of bill introduction, so we'll see what comes up. But we only have, as NCR, we only have 2 main bills coming up. We do have some interim studies that we're looking at, but those won't be introduced until later.
Okay. Any other things in other states that you're looking at that might find their way to Nebraska that you're kind of keeping an eye on? We
are keeping an eye on some of the stuff that's been going on the West Coast, specifically the automatic voter registration. It started off in Oregon, it's kind of trickled down into California. And what it is right now how Motor Voter works is you go, you get your driver's license, and then you can opt in to be registered to vote. How automatic voter registration works is it's kind of the reverse. You have to opt out of not being registered to vote. So we're looking at seeing how that's implemented in those states. And one of the reasons we're kind of waiting on it specifically is 2 populations that we work very closely with raise some, I guess, some questions. One being the disability community. A lot of them don't have driver's licenses, so they feel like that doesn't really help with their community. And they want to see it expanded beyond DMVs to public assistance in general. So if you were to register for SNAP or, disability compensation, they want it to kind of go beyond the DMV. The second being specifically those, since we have felony disenfranchisement here in Nebraska, where if you commit a felony, you then are disenfranchised while you're serving your sentence and then for 2 years after, they're worried about what may happen for those that are post-incarceration and are able to get a driver's license but haven't quite hit that 2-year mark. What if they accidentally get registered to vote? We're accidentally registering when you're not supposed to as a Class 4 felony. So now we're possibly putting felons who haven't gotten their right to vote yet back in kind of a quandary of, so we're waiting to see how that goes because we want to make sure we protect those populations and they don't fall through the cracks if we were to do automatic voter registration. So that's one we're looking at, but we're waiting to see how it's implemented. Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks for being with us today and sharing this information and what you're doing to protect voter rights and help voters with registration with their questions and issues. Glad to have you today. Yes, thanks for having me. Thank you. And I think that's all the time we have for today for our program for the League of Women Voters. This is Geri Simon reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, talk to others about them, and when election time comes around, go vote, Omaha.